started these banks all over Europe.
Assigned them, so you take that.
Yeah, they
country, you
assigned,
take that
and
country, you take
they set them up with the idea of
collaborative.
controlling the government's money. Because as soon as, and there's a statement, as soon as you control the government's money, you control the government.
Were they Jewish?
No, and that's the whole thing. See, some people think they're Jewish because they look at the name Rothschild. They think, oh, that sounds like a Jewish name, but his name wasn't. That wasn't his original name. He was a German.
Okay.
So he wasn't
Tell my boss that.
he wasn't necessarily, and I don't know, he may have been Jewish, but his name, his real name didn't represent him as being Jewish.
Right.
So anyway, we come up to the late 1800s when we have J.P. Morgan, and he comes to the United States, and he's actually a representative of the Rothschild banks. But he comes over here and plants himself in and looks like an American. And they begin the process of doing again what's been tried many times, and that is to set up a central bank in America.
So what year was J.P. Morgan doing that?
This was in relationship to the Federal Reserve itself. It started in the early 1900s. I think it was like 1907 they had a depression. They had a big bank collapse. And the reason for it was to try and get people scared. But it didn't, you know,
Yes.
there wasn't enough support, enough government influence and ability to make it, to follow through with it. And so it was, for some reason, it just fixed itself. Because nobody was manipulating it. Or they didn't have the power, enough power to manipulate it, so it fixed itself. So we come back, we come up to 1913.
Yeah, that's
And leading up to this, we have a meeting which took place on Jekyll Island by representatives of the main banks and a particular senator who was financed by them in his office. They got together at Jekyll Island very secretly.
South
None
Carolina?
of this, yeah, in South Carolina, none of this was known. No, it's Georgia, in fact, it's outside
Of course
Georgia,
it's
because remember James was there.
That's right.
But the whole story was told, I think, in the 1920s. One of the guys came out and started to tell the story because he was so proud of what they'd done. But at the time this happened, nobody knew outside these men and the close relation, those closely related with them. They planned this whole central bank, which they cleverly said, what are we going to call this? Let's call it the Federal Reserve. And now everybody thinks it's a government entity. But it has nothing to do with the government. It's a collection of banks, and today it's a collection of international banks. It's not even American banks. It's international banks from all over the world are part of the Federal Reserve.
So no more federal than Federal Express.
Yes, Federal Express, yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so they get together, they plan this, and then of course they plan how are they going to make this happen. And so what they do is they start telling people, they start diminishing the faith of the people in the banking system, saying the banking system's out of control. Well, who made the banking system out of control? They did. But the banking system's out of control, and as they were bringing up this whole thing about the Federal Reserve, they were actually fighting against it. The big bankers, J.P. Morgan, were saying, "Oh, don't give us the Federal Reserve. Oh, please don't
Oh, yeah.
don't throw me in the briar patch.
Patch.
You know,
Yeah.
don't throw me in the briar patch.
Exactly.
Oh, do anything but throw me in the briar patch. Do anything but create a central bank, a Federal Reserve, because then we're in real trouble." And so people swallowed it hook, line, and sinker and believed them. And then they elected a president called Woodrow Wilson, who supported him, and they very heavily manipulated that whole election so that Wilson had to win, couldn't lose, and so they got their Federal Reserve. And so I just put here, Federal Reserve is hiring a rat to clear out the vermin. And that's basically what it was, is you had this problem, and so you hired the people that were really causing the problem. The system they use is they have something they want to accomplish. And so then they step back and create the problem
Right.
that will allow them to get their end. And it goes by this principle, and this is the principle they live by, is that the end always justifies the means.
Isn't that
It
called-
doesn't matter what you do to
Sounds
get that end,
familiar.
because that end is what's important.
And that's called the Hegelian dialect, right?
Mm.
Right.
Okay. So we get the Federal Reserve. And so what's the impact of the Federal Reserve? The idea of the Federal Reserve was to stop money from fluctuating so much, to keep control so that through the decades before the Federal Reserve, as these men wanted to get more and more power over banking, there obviously is always going to be some problems with banking because of human nature. People are not going to do the job they could, or they're going to have. And so there were banks that failed, problems that happened through time. Joseph Smith, they had a bank during a period which was in great fluctuation, and it caused real problems. That's just a natural part, but as it goes naturally, it always fixes itself. Well, these guys didn't want that to keep happening. They wanted to be in control of it. And so the idea was that we would no longer have depressions or bank failures or any problems because they would keep it under control. So what's the first big thing that happens? Well, in the 1920s, they created an era of great prosperity. And then, of course, after World War I, they created an imbalanced situation where Germany was paying for the world to be prosperous. While Germany was going into terrible inflation and dying, the rest of the world was benefiting from them. And so there was a lot of prosperity going on. And so they convinced people to get into very risky stock practices. And then in 1929, they pulled the rug out from under it. And what they did is all these big bankers went and sold all their stocks. And at least this is one of the things that happened, so that they got all their cash out. When they got all their cash out, everything started to collapse. People got scared. Everybody ran out. What happened? Well, let's see. What did the Rothschild do back in England? As soon as everybody got out and everything crashed, they came back with all their money and bought it all up. And they came through smelling vodka rose. So we have the Great Depression, which was caused by the bankers and was perpetuated by the bankers and those people they controlled, because, and I guess the other thing I want to bring up, the terms that they use in the economic terms for what's happening is they call it boom and bust.
Yeah,
You get the economy booms, and then it's got to bust, and these cycles. And the importance about the gold standard is it reduces the possibility of boom and bust. It keeps the booms and busts under greater control than anything else. What the bankers want and what they've used through time is they've taken us away from the gold standard. In 1933, FDR went and separated our money from the gold standard, and he actually made it illegal to have gold. They brought all the gold in, and they made it so that money was no longer tied to the gold standard. So then they could start having whatever money they wanted.
And that was
And
in
government
33.
and money became
Hello.
was not valued by how much gold was behind it. It was valued by how much government force was behind it. So money is only as much value as the government says it is. Right now, the dollars that we have only have value because the government says they do. They're worthless pieces of paper. Because you can't go and say, give me this much gold or this much silver for them.
And they made it illegal to do so.
Yeah, and they made it illegal to have
No,
gold and to trade in gold.
We could do that with dollar bills with silver when I was a kid. I remember.
Yeah, well, there
you could
were
go to the
silver
bank, You
certificates.
could get silver for it, but not gold, not gold,
No,
you know.
and gold is pretty well gone. They still had silver
But
certificates.
silver, you can't do that now, right?
Well, I mean, gold's back out there now. You can get gold, but money's not tied to it, so it doesn't matter. And then Nixon, he made the final break. For years and years, the dollar had been the standard upon which international currency regulated itself, and it was backed by gold. Well, because of their practices and what they were doing, and because governments outside started panicking, and they started asking for gold back, and gold started emptying to the point where we didn't even begin to have gold to back up the amount of US dollars who were out in the world. Nixon came in and says, oh, you can't get gold for your dollars anymore. We don't have to give you gold, they just have value because we say they do. And so that made it so money was totally fiat money, it's called, which means it has no standard. And so then what the Federal Reserve took over was saying how much money supply there would be and who controlled, and interest rates, and all these little mechanisms they use to supposedly control the money supply, which only in the end effect throws it off, because it prevents the natural influences from taking place.
So was Nixon one of the pawns of this whole scheme?
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Most of these presidents that you're mentioning
Oh,
here
yeah,
were.
all of them have been.
Ever since
Yeah.
Woodrow
We
Wilson
haven't
for
had a
sure.
president, we haven't had a president since, almost forever in the country. Other than the very early days, we haven't had a president who wasn't influenced by these principles, and then especially when you get up to Teddy Roosevelt in that era, it became, there were a couple in the middle, in the early 20s, and I'm trying, was it
Helen Coolidge.
Helen Coolidge.
He was
That
probably the
guy-
last one.
Yeah.
That guy, the president before him died.
Warren Harding.
Yeah, Harding, and Harding was pretty good, but not quite, but Coolidge came in and he just tightened down the screws tight as could be. He would not spend money that didn't need to be spent, but then when he was gone, he was backing off and running again.
So that just makes me curious. We've talked before about people being unknowing pawns of these conspiracies
Mhm.
and others that are active. And so
Yeah.
would you say most of these presidents have been the unknowing pawns or the actively involved type?
No, they've
Woodrow
known
Wilson on
each
his
other.
deathbed admitted to it. He just said he felt like he had sold his country. Sold his country.
I think he was unknowing in the sense, I think
Well,
a
he
lot of them are
wasn't
unknowing
manipulated.
only in the sense that they really believe in it. And they're not of a moral standard, that they
Believe that
will
an elite should
recognize
rule.
and recognize that the end does not justify the means.
And what did you call that, Kathleen? Not justified in means, you said it's the,
The elite should rule.
oh, the elite should rule.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that they know better than the
Yeah.
common folks. Right.
Okay, and so during all this time, the Federal Reserve and those with it have been behind all the wars, because in war they make money.
Hi, sweetie. Come on in.
J.P. Morgan was a major force behind for World War I, and he set up the Lusitania, and he supplied many of the arms and munitions for it, and that was a setup so that everybody knew it was going to be sunk, because it was set up to be sunk, and then anyway, that's like I say, I could spend hours on this. That's what changed American opinion, because America was not going to get into the war until the Lusitania. And then they did again the same thing in the Second World War. With the First World War, they tried to set up the League of Nations, and it didn't work because there was still too many smart people in Congress. And so with
didn't
the
have enough plants
manipulations,
yet.
they brought Hitler into power and financed